So, as a number of you know, this has been an interesting and challenging week for my family and for me, and also for our community. As Shar mentioned, Byron Searcy passing this past week and had his memorial service on Monday. Byron was involved in a couple of our book groups, as well as sat over here with his wife Pam and often read his poetry in here, and was a longtime member of this church and an active member in the community as a real estate individual and a developer, and just a man of interesting variety. He was what I would call a gentle giant. Played right tackle for OU during some of its victory seasons, its national championships in the mid-late 50s. And I always imagined how a right tackle could be that nice. And I imagine him knocking people over and then, sort of helping them back up and saying, "Good job," and then, but he was apparently very intense and intentional in his position. But also, my wife's mother then died the day before. I was participating in Byron's service, and that was unexpected. I'm saying all of this simply to say that I debated whether or not to be here this morning because her funeral was yesterday. And it's been a challenging week. My mother is not well, and hasn't been well, and deteriorating rapidly over the last 2 weeks as well. So we kind of expected my mother actually to go first. And in fact, my mother, who has a very good sense of humor, we've been joking with her. She's very conscious, but just wasting away and has a number of things going on. But I joked with her. I said, "Mom, you're not reading anymore." And she said, "No, I don't want to read anymore." I said, "Well, Mom, you're not even eating now." I really don't want to eat. And I said, "Well, Mom, you're not even watching TV?" And she said, "No, there's nothing on. I don't want to watch TV. So it's just sitting in a chair." And I said, "So your strategy is you're going to bore yourself to death." And she just cracked up and started laughing. And she said, "If it could work faster, I'd be more bored, But she's 88, and she's had a great life and a great spirit, but it's been a challenging week. So what I thought about, I worked on stuff. I really did. I worked on a message to come before you today, and the reality is that I continued to work on it, and I continued to work on it, and I realized, this is going to be good next week. So I'm going to do what I read in a Facebook post by a friend of ours out in California who has a little 5-year-old girl, Kaylee, who she had said that her daughter Kaylee just would not stop talking all holiday long. Maybe the excitement, who knows what, but she just would not stop talking until finally she said, "Why do you keep talking so much?" And her daughter Kaylee said to her, she said, "Mom, I keep talking because I'm going to make sense at some point." And I'm sure she heard her dad or somebody else say that, but coming out of her mouth, it was like out of the mouth of babes, So I decided that's my strategy this morning. I'm going to keep talking for the next, 10 minutes or so, and eventually I'm hoping that I'll make some sense. A friend of mine sent me a post. Well, first, before we get started, I want this series that we're going to be doing for the next 5-6 weeks. This is Epiphany. It's the season of Epiphany, and I didn't say Happy Epiphany. I said Happy New Year, but really I should also say Happy Epiphany to you as well, because Epiphany is sort of the unknown sacred holiday, the unknown sacred date, high season. It sort of gets passed over because it comes right between Christmas and Easter, two of the most celebrated, for different reasons, seasons of the church, two of the most attended events of the church. And yet, in between is this season of Epiphany. It just kind of gets overlooked completely. And Epiphany literally means the sort of coming to deep understanding of some essential nature of something. So it's not like an insight where you just sort of like gain an insight, a new learning or something. It's this deep understanding of something essential about life. And it's celebrated as the time when the 3 wise men, as the story goes, they were sent by King Herod to find out where this child that he'd heard about was. And when they find him, something happens. They see him. Their lives are changed. They go home by a different route. And they no longer are there. It sort of plays out initially like a Game of Thrones episode where the king has sort of sent these guys out to find out what's going to happen because you know what the plot is, and you're watching the show, and this guy's bad. This king means bad news. He doesn't just want to know about it. He's going to kill him, and he's going to kill everybody else too because it's all about the king. But these wise men go with this errand with this intention and discover something else. They have an epiphany, and they experience epiphany. So in this season of Epiphany, we're going to take a look at what is life. But not just what is life. I want to look at the idea of life. So think for just a minute. All the different ways you have heard this phrase completed. Life is. Think of all the different ways. And then give me some of them. Life is good. Life is beautiful. Life is like a dream. And somebody, thank you very much. Life is like a box of chocolates. Yeah. Where would we be without culture? Life is what? Life is a journey. Life is what you make it of it. Life is long. Life is short. Life is living. Life is difficult. Two of those, yeah. Life is celebration. Life is love. Life is just a bowl of cherries. Life is a bowl of rotten cherries. Life is and life is not, right? I mean, it's interesting. Every one of these, life is, we have life is not. Life is long, life is short. Life's a box of chocolates. Life's an empty box of chocolates. I mean, we have them all, right? We have both sides, this idea of life is, and yet life is not. And what I want to think about is, over this next series, is all the ways in which our culture has had such a major influence on who we are, our understanding, our enlightenment as a society over the years. Life has sort of become synonymous with our understanding of God as well. If you start thinking about it, some of the very idioms we use about life are also idioms we use about God. We think about God. It's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It's just something to think about. So I want to do that over the next few weeks, be thinking about that, and we have some wonderful things. We have a guest speaker coming on the 22nd, Karen Blessing, who was with us last year and who will be with us again to share some thoughts from her perspective. And Sharm is going to be speaking with us in one of the Sundays in January. So we're going to be reflecting on this idea of life is like, and thinking about what it means to be a part of Epiphany, to experience Epiphany. So a friend of mine sends me this Facebook post, a little experience he had at New Year's because he thought it was kind of interesting. He said the New Year kicked off really good for him. He was feeling good. The last year had been okay. He wasn't like everybody else who'd sort of said 2016 was a terrible, crappy year, and all the cultural icons were dying, and it was just miserable, and the political divisiveness. He says, no, I'm much more optimistic about that. He says, I really feel good about it. And then he says, I'm really hopeful about what's going on for my life. And so he said, I got in my car, and I was going to pick up a friend, and as I was driving down the road in my car, this enormous bird dookie hits the front windshield. And he said it was just right in the middle of my path. And he said, so I did what you would do. I took the windshield wiper, turned it on, and it hit that. And of course, it smeared it, he said, but it didn't just smear it, the bulk of it didn't budge. So he said, I hit it on high. And it was just knocking that thing, but it wasn't budging. He said it was like a nuclear bird dookie. It wasn't going anywhere. And he said, so then I sprayed it, right? So I go to get to the friend's house. I pick him up, and he's like, John, look at your windshield, And he says, yeah, I know. And he said he got in the car, and he started driving. And he said, I just hit it with more windshield wash and the wipers. And he said, nothing I was doing was knocking this thing off. It was just making things worse. And my friend looked at me, and he said, had it occurred to you to pull off the side of the road and wipe it off? And he said, why did that never occur to me? He said, so I pulled over, got a piece of paper from inside, a napkin. I got outside, and I simply wiped it off, and then it was clean, and we started down the road. Ogden Nash, has this great quote that I read about New Year's quotes. Every New Year is a direct descendant, isn't it, of a long line of criminals. Do you know what he means by that? The antecedent to that is what Einstein used to say. You can never solve a problem with the same thinking that got you there. Every new year is a direct descendant of a long line of proven criminals. Epiphanies are about seeing things that transform us. They're literally about discovery. And I have to sadly, maybe not so sadly, but confessionally, I have to talk about what's been happening over the past week or so, because it has dominated my life, and as I understand, lives of others in our community. And so I just share a few thoughts. Some of them epiphany, but a lot of them just insights. At the beginning of the week, after my mother-in-law died, there was a lot of stress and tension, of course. And going into this year, from the last year, a lot of stress, as I mentioned, with the political divisiveness and just the sort of, at the end of the year, these cultural icons that are sort of dying, especially for those of us who are boomers, who sort of grew up with these individuals. They sort of represented a reality of our lives, right? That life is fragile, that life has finitude to it, finality to it. So in the midst of all of that, when my mother-in-law died and we were dealing with that, I was experiencing something that I hadn't experienced much before, or not for a long time. This sense of isolation, this sense of disconnectedness. And in the midst of that, when I would least expect it, someone would come up and hug me. It was one of the doctors there who was one of the hospitalists that came up to Linda as Betty was in a coma, and he was Sikh. He was a Sikh, had the I don't know what the official name of it. Thank you. It was like a turban, and he was the hospitalist who came up to her, and he was very polite, but he stared at Linda. He studied Linda carefully, and Linda's pretty fragile at the moment, so he just stood beside her and just visited with her about what her mother's situation was and what was happening. And then at one point, Linda stood up and reached out to thank him, and then he kind of smiled gently, and she looked at him strangely, and he opened up his arms and just hugged her. And she said it was the strangest thing, because it was exactly, not just what I needed at that moment, but it was from the least likely person I expected it to happen. The next day or two, a friend of hers contacted someone she hadn't talked to for a number of years, and had just reached out and said, we need to get together. Family members who had been estranged for some time began to show up out of nowhere. All of these sort of things started falling in place that began to suggest there's something else there at the ground of all of our lives. Sometimes it takes a crisis to remind us of that. Sometimes not. I don't know if you know of this wonderful place. It's an Ethiopian restaurant that's right next to 7-Eleven on Camp Bowie. A guy named Samson runs the place. He owns it, and then he runs the 7-Eleven next to it. I didn't know this, but my son, when he was younger, and he's now 23, but when he was younger, he used to go over there and hang out and visit with Samson. Just visit with him. They just knew each other by first name. But somewhere along the line this past week, Samson saw my son's posting about his grandmother. And he didn't post something back. Out of the blue, my son said he was riding in his car. He looked down, and there was this strange number that he didn't recognize. But my son has not yet gotten to that point where he doesn't answer numbers he doesn't recognize. And so he answered it, and it was Samson. And Samson had said, I heard about what had happened, and I want you to know that I'm thinking of you, and that I hope you are well, and that you know that you are loved. Well, Samson's Muslim. Out of the least expected place, from the least expected people. I think that Epiphany is one of those things that we think of as as a magical moment. At my mother-in-law's service, Bill Longsworth read this text that's a favorite of Linda's and mine, and we asked him to read it. And I'll read it to you. It wasn't necessarily one of Betty's favorite texts, but it was one of ours. It's sort of what I consider the other side of Epiphany, sort of the next step. You know, the first we drum and then we... This is sort of the first Epiphany and then. Comes from 1 John chapter 4. Beloved, let us love one another because love is from God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. Who does not love does not know God, for God is love. God's love was revealed among us this way, that God sent his Son into the world that we might have life, might live through him. And this is love, not that we loved, but that we are loved. Beloved, since God loved us so much, we ought to love one another. And then it goes on, God lives in us and love is perfected in us. But this is what it says, by this we know we abide in God and God is in us because we love. And what struck me about this passage that's so fascinating with me about understanding Epiphany, you can't get away from it. You can't get away from love. The experiences that I've had this past week and the experiences that Linda's had and perhaps the experiences that you've had as well is no matter how divisive you feel towards another person, no matter how much estrangement is there, what is also there is that longing to be connected. What is also there is that spark that just wants permission to open up, to love. It's always there. What's required is this openness to start seeing it. No matter where we are, is to simply begin to open up. And that's the challenge of going home another way, right? That's the challenge of not seeing the same criminals that have been there every year as we start a new one and hope something's different. The challenge is to start opening to the love that is there even if we don't see it. If we say there's God, there's love. If we say there's not love, there's no God. It's as simple as that. God is love. God is life. Life is love. Life is what you make it, then, beloved, let us love one another.